Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is William Brown, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire, near the abandoned logging town of Livermore, where the Sawyer River Trail disappears into miles of unmarked backcountry. I should have known something was wrong the moment Atlas started whimpering. My German Shepherd had been my constant companion for 6 years, through deployments overseas as a military contractor and countless camping trips across New England. Atlas was fearless. I'd seen him face down black bears without so much as a tremor. But as we set up camp in the clearing beside the half-frozen Sawyer River, 3 miles past where the official trail ended, he pressed against my legs and wouldn't stop shaking. "Easy, boy," I murmured, scratching behind his ears. "Just the wind." But it wasn't just the wind. Even I could feel it. Something fundamentally wrong with this place. Like stepping into a photograph where all the shadows fell in the wrong directions. The silence was too complete, too absolute. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, no buzz of insects. Just the soft gurgle of the partially frozen river and the whisper of wind through bare November branches. I'd chosen this spot specifically for its isolation. After the company layoffs and my ex-wife's latest round of custody negotiations, I needed to disappear for a few days. The abandoned settlement of Livermore had been wiped off most maps since the 1950s, swallowed by the expanding national forest. Perfect for someone who wanted to be left alone with his thoughts and his dog. The campsite sat in a natural clearing surrounded by towering white pines and skeletal hardwoods. Granite outcroppings jutted from the forest floor like ancient bones. According to my research, this area had once been home to a thriving logging community until mysterious disappearances and accidents forced its abandonment. Local Abenaki legends spoke of creatures that hunted these woods, beings that wore the faces of the missing. I dismissed it as typical regional folklore designed to keep tourists away from dangerous terrain. Atlas refused to leave my side as I pitched the tent, his amber eyes darting constantly to the tree line. When I tried to stake out his lead near the fire pit, he planted his feet and wouldn't budge. "Fine," I said, clipping his leash to my belt. "We'll do this together." The sun set with unnatural speed, or maybe that was just my imagination. One moment I was arranging my gear in the fading daylight, the next I was fumbling for my headlamp in complete darkness. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in minutes, my breath forming clouds that seemed to linger too long in the still air. I built a fire using seasoned hardwood I'd brought from home. The flames caught easily enough, but they burned wrong, too blue at the base, throwing dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the flickering light. Atlas whined and pressed closer, his fur standing on end. "Just the cold, buddy," I said. But my voice sounded thin and unconvincing even to me. I heated a can of beef stew over the fire and shared it with Atlas, both of us eating in silence. The darkness beyond our small circle of light felt oppressive, almost tangible. I'd always been comfortable in the woods at night, but this was different. This darkness had weight, presence. It pressed against the edges of the firelight like something alive. When I spread my sleeping bag in the tent, Atlas refused to stay outside. He squeezed through the flap and curled up beside me, trembling despite his thick coat. I didn't have the heart to make him leave. Sleep came in fragments. I'd drift off only to wake to Atlas growling low in his throat, ears pricked toward some sound I couldn't hear. Each time I checked my watch, only minutes had passed, but it felt like hours. The darkness outside seemed to shift and breathe, pressing against the thin nylon walls of the tent. Around 3 a.m., Atlas bolted upright and started barking. Not his usual warning bark, but something desperate and primal. The sound echoed strangely in the clearing, as if the forest was swallowing it before it could travel far. "What is it?" I whispered, my hand finding the knife on my belt. He was staring at the tent flap, every muscle rigid. I held my breath and listened. Nothing but the river and wind, but Atlas kept barking until I thought my eardrums would burst. Then, as suddenly as it started, he stopped. His ears drooped, his tail tucked between his legs, and he crawled to the far corner of the tent. When I reached for him, he flinched away from my touch. I lay awake until dawn, watching the tent walls slowly brighten from black to gray. Atlas didn't move from his corner, didn't respond when I called his name. He just stared at the tent flap with glassy, unfocused eyes. When I finally unzipped the entrance, the morning revealed fresh snow dusting the clearing, snow that had fallen silently during the night. But what made my blood run cold were the tracks circling our campsite. Huge prints, almost human, but wrong in every detail. Too long, too narrow, with claw marks gouged deep into the frozen earth. They came right up to the tent, close enough that whatever made them could have reached through the fabric and touched us. Atlas wouldn't look at the tracks. When I tried to point them out, he turned his head away and whimpered. I should have packed up and left right then. Any rational person would have. But I'd driven 4 hours and hiked 3 miles to get here, and my pride wouldn't let me run from some animal tracks. Besides, Atlas was probably just spooked by the unfamiliar territory. Dogs could sense things humans couldn't. Elevation changes, weather patterns, underground water. There had to be a logical explanation. I spent the morning exploring the ruins of old Livermore, hoping to tire Atlas out and shake off the oppressive feeling that had settled over the clearing. Foundation stones poked through the snow like broken teeth, marking where houses and businesses once stood. A few rusted pieces of logging equipment lay scattered among the trees, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Atlas followed listlessly, his usual enthusiasm for new smells and territory completely absent. He moved like a dog twice his age, stopping frequently to stare at nothing, his head tilted as if listening to sounds only he could hear. We found the old cemetery around noon, hidden behind a grove of ancient hemlocks. Most of the headstones had fallen or crumbled, but a few granite markers still stood at crooked angles. The dates I could make out ranged from the 1890s to the 1940s, then stopped abruptly. Many of the newer graves bore the same date, November 15, 1943. Mass accident, I muttered, brushing snow from a partially legible stone. Probably a logging disaster. But as I read more carefully, I realized these weren't accident victims. The inscriptions where they remained intact told a different story. Taken by the woods. Lost to the hunger. May he find peace in death. One marker, newer than the rest, simply read, William Sawyer, the last to see, the last to tell. Atlas whined and pawed at my leg, pulling me away from the graves. For the first time all day, his behavior seemed normal, protective rather than fearful. I let him lead me back toward camp, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The trees seemed different on the return trip, though I couldn't pinpoint why. The same trail, the same landmarks, but everything felt subtly wrong, like a familiar room rearranged by someone else. Atlas kept looking over his shoulder, his ears swiveling to track sounds I couldn't hear. Back at the campsite, I tried to call my ex-wife to check on our daughter, but my phone showed no signal. Strange. I'd had 2 bars that morning. I hiked to higher ground, but even on the ridge overlooking the valley, my phone remained dead. The GPS function had stopped working too, showing our location as a blank gray void. That's when I noticed Atlas was missing. I'd been focused on getting a signal, and when I looked down, his leash hung empty from my belt. The metal clip was still fastened, but somehow he'd slipped free. "Atlas!" I called, my voice cracking in the thin air. "Atlas, come!" The forest swallowed my shouts without echo. I scrambled down from the ridge, calling his name until my throat burned. No answering bark, no rustle of movement through the underbrush. It was as if he'd simply vanished. I spent the afternoon searching, following every game trail and deer path within a mile of camp. The tracks from the night before had melted away with the snow, leaving no trace of what had circled our tent. I found a few scattered paw prints in the mud near the river, but they led nowhere, ending abruptly at the water's edge. As darkness approached, panic set in. Atlas had never run off before, never failed to come when called. He was my responsibility, my companion, my last connection to stability in a world that seemed determined to strip everything away from me. I built up the fire higher than necessary, feeding it constantly to keep the flames dancing bright against the encroaching night. Without Atlas pressed against my side, the clearing felt impossibly vast and exposed. Every shadow could hide watching eyes. Every sound could herald something emerging from the darkness. Around 10 p.m., I heard him barking. The sound came from deep in the forest, maybe half a mile northeast of camp. Not his usual bark, but close enough that my heart leaped with relief. I grabbed my headlamp and flashlight and plunged into the woods, following the sound. "Atlas, here, boy, I'm coming." The barking continued, always seeming to move away as I got closer. I crashed through underbrush and scrambled over deadfall, my lights carving wild arcs through the darkness. Branches tore at my jacket and face, but I kept going, following that familiar sound. It took me 20 minutes to realize the barking was leading me in circles. I stopped, breathing hard, and really listened. The sound was wrong. Too mechanical, too perfectly timed. Real dogs paused between barks, changed pitch and intensity based on their emotional state. This was like a recording playing on repeat, and it was coming from multiple directions at once. A chill that had nothing to do with the November air ran down my spine. I clicked off my lights and stood perfectly still in the darkness, letting my eyes adjust. Gradually, shapes emerged from the black. Tree trunks, boulders, the faint gleam of snow in open patches, and movement. Something large shifting position about 30 yards to my left, trying to stay hidden behind a massive pine. I forced myself to breathe slowly, quietly. Whatever was out there, it was watching me, had probably been watching me since I entered the woods. The fake barking had stopped, but I could hear something else now, a wet, rhythmic sound like labored breathing. My hand found the knife on my belt, though I doubted it would do much good against something large enough to imitate a dog's bark so perfectly. I had to get back to camp, to the fire, to some semblance of safety. But which direction was camp? In my panicked chase through the forest, I'd lost all sense of direction. That's when Atlas walked out of the trees. He emerged from the shadows about 20 feet away, moving with his usual confident gait. In the dim starlight filtering through the canopy, he looked perfectly normal. Same size, same coloring, same collar with its jingling tags. "Atlas," I whispered, relief flooding through me. "Jesus, boy, you scared me. Come here." He approached slowly, head low, tail wagging in a lazy arc, but as he got closer, something about his movement made me uneasy. Too fluid, too controlled. Atlas was an energetic dog, always bouncing and fidgeting, but this version moved with predatory grace. He stopped just outside the range of my headlamp beam, close enough that I could see the gleam of his eyes reflecting the light. But the reflection was wrong. Too bright, too blue, like looking into deep water. "Come on, buddy," I said, patting my leg. "Let's go home." Atlas tilted his head at an unnatural angle, studying me with those wrong-colored eyes. When he opened his mouth, I expected to see his usual pink tongue lolling out. Instead, there were too many teeth, all of them sharp, all of them gleaming wet in the pale light. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam wavering across his face. The thing wearing Atlas's shape didn't react to the light, didn't blink or turn away. It just stood there, watching, its mouth hanging open in a parody of a friendly pant. "You're not Atlas," I whispered. The thing tilted its head further, bones popping audibly in its neck. When it spoke, the voice was a perfect imitation of my own. "Atlas, it said in my voice. "Jesus, boy, you scared me. Come here." I ran. Branches whipped at my face and clothing as I crashed through the forest, my lights dancing wildly, casting everything in stark, terrifying relief. Behind me, I could hear the thing following, not running, but moving with that same fluid, predatory gait. It was in no hurry. It knew these woods better than I did. I had no idea where I was going, only that I had to keep moving. The trees seemed to close in around me, creating a maze of trunks and shadows. Every direction looked the same. Every path led deeper into the darkness. Then I saw the glow of my campfire through the trees and nearly sobbed with relief. I burst into the clearing and threw more wood on the flames, building them high enough to push back the darkness. Only then did I dare to look over my shoulder. The tree line remained empty, but I could feel eyes watching from the shadows beyond the firelight. Somewhere in the forest, the Atlas thing was waiting, studying, learning. I dragged my gear closer to the fire and settled in for what I knew would be the longest night of my life. My real Atlas was dead. Had to be dead, because that thing in the woods was wearing his shape like an ill-fitting costume. The knowledge sat heavy in my chest, a grief so sharp it made breathing difficult. But I couldn't grieve, not yet. I had to survive the night first. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. I fed the fire constantly, keeping the flames dancing high. Every few minutes, I'd sweep my flashlight beam across the perimeter of the clearing, checking for movement in the shadows. Sometimes I caught glimpses of reflected light, eyes watching from between the trees. Around 3 a.m., I heard my own voice calling from the forest. "Help me," it said, perfectly mimicking my tone and inflection. "I'm lost. Please, someone help me." The voice moved around the clearing in a slow circle, always staying just beyond the range of the firelight. Sometimes it was my voice, sometimes Atlas's barking, sometimes sounds I'd never heard before. Wet, sliding noises that made my skin crawl. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the sounds seemed to come from inside my head. The thing was learning, adapting, adding new voices to its repertoire. I heard my ex-wife calling my name, my daughter crying for help, my own voice pleading and begging for assistance. By dawn, I was barely holding on to my sanity. The fire had burned down to coals despite my efforts, and exhaustion made my hands shake as I fed it fresh wood. The voices had stopped, but the feeling of being watched remained constant. I had to get out of these woods. Whatever was hunting me was intelligent, patient, and wearing the face of my dead dog. It knew exactly which buttons to push, which sounds would break me down. If I stayed another night, I wouldn't see another sunrise. I broke camp with shaking hands, stuffing gear into my pack with little regard for organization. The important thing was speed, distance, escape. I'd deal with the emotional aftermath later, if there was a later. The hike back to the trailhead should have taken 3 hours. I'd mark the route carefully on my way in, noting landmarks and GPS coordinates. But nothing looked familiar now. The trail seemed to fork and branch in directions I didn't remember, leading off into sections of forest that felt wrong, alien. My compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. My GPS remained dead, showing the same gray void where our location should be. It was as if the forest was actively trying to keep me lost, to prevent my escape. I'd been hiking for 5 hours when I realized I was walking in circles. The distinctive granite outcropping should have been a landmark I passed once, near the beginning of the trail. But there it was again, jutting from the forest floor like a broken tooth. I'd passed it 3 times now, approaching from different directions each time. That's when I saw Atlas sitting at the base of the rocks. He looked perfect, exactly as he had in life. No wrong-colored eyes, no unnatural grace, no too many teeth. Just my dog, waiting patiently for me to catch up. His tail wagged when he saw me, and he let out a soft woof of greeting. "Atlas," I whispered, afraid to hope. He bounded toward me with his usual enthusiasm, every movement familiar and right. When he reached me, he pressed against my legs and looked up with his honest brown eyes. The right color this time. Warm and intelligent and completely normal. I wanted to believe. God, how I wanted to believe. This was my dog, my companion, the one constant in my increasingly unstable life. I reached down to scratch behind his ears, and he leaned into the touch just the way he always had. But his fur was cold, corpse cold, and there was no warmth of breath from his open mouth. I jerked my hand back as if burned. Atlas continued to wag his tail and pant, his expression friendly and expectant. But no breath misted in the cold air, and when I looked closely I could see that his eyes, while the right color, didn't blink often enough. "You're dead," I said, backing away slowly. "You're dead, and something's wearing your skin." Atlas tilted his head at exactly the angle he used to when confused. The gesture was so perfectly him that tears burned my eyes. This thing knew every detail, every mannerism, every tiny quirk that made Atlas unique. It had studied him, learned him, consumed him so completely that it could replicate every movement. The Atlas thing opened its mouth and spoke in a perfect imitation of my daughter's voice. "Daddy, why did you leave me?" I turned and ran deeper into the forest. There was no plan now, no strategy beyond pure animal panic. The trees blurred past as I crashed through underbrush and scrambled over obstacles. Behind me, I could hear the thing following, sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on 4, sometimes moving in ways that defied anatomy. The voices came from all around me now. My ex-wife, my daughter, my parents, friends, co-workers, everyone I'd ever cared about calling my name, pleading for help, asking why I'd abandoned them. The words cut deeper than any physical wound, each one perfectly calibrated to inflict maximum psychological damage. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs shook, but the forest seemed endless. Every tree looked the same, every path led nowhere. It was like being trapped in a nightmare where the exit kept moving just out of reach. Then I stumbled into another clearing and saw something that made my heart stop. My campsite. E2 exactly as I'd left it that morning, down to the scattered ashes of my fire and the impression my tent had left in the pine needles. But that was impossible. I'd been hiking away from this spot for hours, had covered miles of difficult terrain. The Atlas thing emerged from the trees behind me, no longer bothering to maintain its disguise. It was still roughly dog-shaped, but the proportions were all wrong now. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent in directions that hurt to look at. Its face was a shifting mixture of Atlas's features and something else, something that belonged in the deepest nightmares of evolution. "William," it said in my daughter's voice, "why won't you play with me anymore?" I fumbled for the knife on my belt, knowing it was useless but needing to hold something. Anything. The thing approached slowly, savoring my terror. It had been playing with me all along, letting me run in circles while it herded me back to where it wanted me. "What do you want?" I gasped. It smiled with too many teeth. "To wear you," it said in my own voice, "to learn you, to become you and walk among the people you've touched. Your daughter will never know the difference." The mention of my daughter ignited something primal in my chest. Whatever this thing was, whatever it wanted from me, I couldn't let it near her. The thought of it wearing my face, speaking with my voice, gaining access to the people I loved, filled me with a rage that burned away fear. I lunged forward with the knife, aiming for what I hoped was a vital area. The blade sank into the thing's chest with a wet, tearing sound, but instead of blood, a thick black ichor oozed from the wound. The thing laughed with Atlas's voice and batted me aside like I weighed nothing. I hit the ground hard, ribs screaming, but managed to keep hold of the knife. The thing loomed over me, its shape shifting and flowing like water. One moment it looked like Atlas, the next like a grotesque parody of a human, the next like something that had never been born on Earth. "I've been so hungry," it whispered in my mother's voice, "so hungry for so long. The others weren't enough. But you have so many connections, so many people who trust you. I'll feast on them one by one." I rolled away as it lunged, its claws gouging deep furrows in the earth where my head had been. The knife felt pathetic in my hand, but it was all I had. I slashed wildly, opening more wounds that leaked black ichor but seemed to cause no real damage. The thing was toying with me, I realized. It could have killed me at any point, but it was drawing out my terror, feeding on fear as much as flesh. Every sob, every whimper, every desperate prayer seemed to make it stronger. That's when I remembered the fire. My campfire had been reduced to cold ashes, but I still had my lighter and emergency fire starter. If this thing was some kind of shapeshifter, something that had survived in these woods by consuming and replacing its victims, then maybe it would have the same vulnerabilities as any predator. I feinted left, then dove right toward my scattered gear. The thing's claws raked across my back, shredding my jacket and drawing blood, but I managed to grab my pack. My fingers found the small bottle of fire starter fluid just as massive weight slammed into me from behind. The impact drove all the air from my lungs and sent the bottle flying. I watched it arc through the air and shatter against a tree trunk, clear liquid splashing across the bark and forest floor. The smell of petroleum filled the clearing. The thing had me pinned now, its weight pressing me into the frozen ground. Up close, I could see that its skin wasn't skin at all, but some kind of chitinous shell that shifted and flowed like living liquid. Underneath, something pale and segmented writhed like exposed muscle. "I'll make it quick," it promised in Atlas's voice. "Your dog fought so hard at the end. Such loyalty, such love. I'll treasure those memories forever." Rage filled me at the image of Atlas's final moments, but also something else, a desperate, half-formed plan. The fire starter was soaked into the wood and ground near the tree, close enough that if I could reach my lighter, I went limp, pretending to give up. The thing relaxed its grip slightly, moving to position itself for a killing blow. That gave me just enough room to roll toward the tree, my hand closing around the lighter. The thing realized what I was doing a split second too late. I flicked the lighter and tossed it toward the petroleum-soaked ground. The flame caught instantly, racing across the spilled fluid in a blue wave that climbed the tree trunk and spread outward in a widening circle. The thing shrieked, a sound like tearing metal and dying animals, and stumbled backward. Where the flames touched it, the false skin began to bubble and slough away, revealing something underneath that my mind refused to process. It was too alien, too fundamentally wrong for human perception. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed a burning branch from the spreading fire. The thing circled me now, its movements erratic and desperate. The flames had damaged something essential, broken whatever allowed it to maintain its stolen shapes. It flickered between forms: Atlas, me, people I didn't recognize, things that might once have been human. "Stay back," I shouted, swinging the burning branch like a club. "Stay the hell away from me!" The thing made one last desperate lunge, but the fire had weakened it. I brought the branch down across what might have been its head, and the impact sent sparks flying. The creature's shriek rose to a pitch that made my ears bleed, then suddenly cut off. It collapsed into a puddle of black ichor that steamed and smoked in the cold air. The smell was indescribable: rotten meat and sulfur and something else, something that made my primitive brain scream warnings about poison and disease. I stood there for a long moment, breathing hard, watching the remains bubble and dissolve. Whatever it had been, it was dead now. Really dead, not just wearing death like another mask. The forest fire I'd started was spreading, but slowly. The recent snow and frozen ground would keep it from becoming a major blaze, and the isolation meant no immediate danger to people or property. I'd call it in once I got back to civilization, but right now I needed to leave this place behind forever. I gathered what remained of my gear and started hiking toward what I hoped was the real trail. This time, my compass pointed steadily north, and my GPS flickered back to life, showing my actual position. The forest felt different now. Still wild, still dangerous, but no longer actively malevolent. It took 6 hours to reach my car, and by then the sun was setting again. I drove straight through to Manchester without stopping, afraid that if I closed my eyes I'd see Atlas's face looking back at me from the darkness. I never found out what happened to the real Atlas. Part of me hopes he died quickly, before that thing could learn all his mannerisms and memories. Part of me wonders if something of him survived inside the creature, trapped and aware while his body was used as a disguise. I made the required reports: missing pet, accidental forest fire, generic wilderness hazards. The authorities accepted my story without question. Dog runs off, owner accidentally starts small brush fire trying to signal for rescue. Both owner and dog lucky to survive. It happens more often than you'd think. I never went back to those woods. I've never taken another camping trip. Never even walked alone through a city park after dark. Something changed in me during those 2 days in the forest. A fundamental trust in the safety of wild places that I'll never get back. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I hear Atlas barking outside my apartment. I never go to the window to look. I just turn up the television and wait for sunrise, telling myself it's just a neighbor's dog, just the wind, just my imagination playing tricks. Because the alternative, that something followed me home from those woods, something that learned my scent and my fears and my weaknesses, is too terrible to consider. My name is William Brown, and I am 34 years old. And I know that somewhere in the darkness, something is still wearing my dog's face and calling my name. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Pemigewasset wilderness of New Hampshire, during what should have been a simple 3-day hiking trip with my best friend Derek. Derek and I had been planning this trip for months. We'd both been working 60-hour weeks at the accounting firm, and the stress was eating us alive. Derek suggested we take a long weekend and disappear into the wilderness. No phones, no emails, just us and the mountains. The Pemigewasset wilderness seemed perfect. 45,000 acres of pristine forest where you could hike for miles without seeing another soul. "It'll be like the old days," Derek had said, grinning as he spread the topographic maps across my kitchen table. "Just you, me, and whatever's waiting out there in the woods." I should have paid more attention to how he phrased that. Derek Martinez had been my closest friend since college. He was the kind of guy who could find humor in anything, even our soul-crushing jobs, and his infectious laugh could pull me out of the darkest moods. But lately, something had been different about him. The laugh came less frequently, and when it did, it seemed forced. He'd grown thinner too, his usual appetite replaced by a strange pickiness about food that I'd never seen before. "You sure you're okay?" I asked him as we loaded our packs into my Jeep that Thursday morning. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his skin had taken on an unhealthy pallor. "Just tired, man. This trip is exactly what I need." He hefted his pack, heavier than usual, I noticed, and gave me what I thought was his old smile. But something about it felt wrong, like he was wearing a mask of his former self. We drove north from Boston in comfortable silence, watching the landscape change from suburbs to rural farmland to dense forest. The October air was crisp, and the trees blazed with autumn colors that should have filled me with excitement. Instead, I felt a growing unease that I couldn't shake. The trailhead parking lot was nearly empty when we arrived at Lincoln Woods. Only 2 other cars sat in the gravel lot, both covered with morning frost that hadn't yet burned off. Derek was unusually quiet as we shouldered our packs and checked our gear one final time. "Last chance to grab signal," I said, holding up my phone. 2 bars flickered weakly. Derek didn't even pull his phone out. "Leave it in the car. This is about disconnecting, remember?" Something in his tone made me hesitate, but I powered down my phone anyway and locked it in the glove compartment. Derek was right. We needed this escape from the digital world. The wilderness trail started easy enough following an old railroad grade through dense hardwood forest. The path was wide and well-maintained, with wooden planks bridging the occasional muddy section. Other hikers had passed this way recently. I could see fresh boot prints in the damp soil. But as we walked deeper into the forest, the familiar sounds of civilization faded completely. No distant car engines. No airplane hum. No human voices. Just the whisper of wind through the trees and the rhythmic crunch of our boots on fallen leaves. "Listen to that," Derek said, stopping suddenly about 2 miles in. "Pure silence." But it wasn't silent at all. I could hear dozens of sounds. Squirrels chattering, birds calling, branches creaking in the breeze. What Derek seemed to be responding to was the absence of human noise, the feeling of being truly alone in the wilderness. We hiked steadily for 4 hours, covering about 8 miles before stopping for lunch near the Franconia Brook. Derek had barely touched his food all day, picking at an energy bar while I devoured my sandwich. "You feeling all right?" I asked again. "Never better." But he said it too quickly, and when he smiled, I noticed his teeth seemed somehow sharper than I remembered. The afternoon brought us deeper into the wilderness, following narrow footpaths that wound between massive white pines and ancient hardwoods. The forest grew denser, the canopy thicker, and the light took on a strange green quality that made everything look slightly surreal. Derek led the way, moving with an energy that seemed at odds with his apparent exhaustion. He navigated the trail markers with confidence, though I could have sworn he'd never hiked this particular route before. "How do you know where you're going?" I called ahead to him. "Just following the path," he replied without turning around. But there were multiple paths now. Game trails and old logging roads branching off in different directions, and Derek seemed to know exactly which ones to take. We made camp that evening in a small clearing beside the east branch of the Pemigewasset River. The spot was perfect. Level ground, fresh water, and natural windbreaks formed by massive granite boulders. Derek had led us straight to it as if he'd been there before. Setting up our tents should have been routine. We'd done it dozens of times, but everything felt off. My hands shook as I drove the stakes, and I kept dropping gear. Derek worked with mechanical precision, but I noticed he kept glancing toward the tree line as the sun began to set. "Getting dark early," I said, trying to make conversation. "I love the darkness," Derek replied, and something in his voice made my skin crawl. "Don't you feel it calling?" I didn't know what he meant, but I definitely felt something. As the last light faded from the sky, the forest seemed to press closer around our small camp. The familiar sounds of evening, crickets, owls, rustling leaves, were somehow wrong. Too quiet in some places, too loud in others, as if the normal rhythms of the wilderness had been disrupted. We cooked dinner over a small camp stove. I'd brought a couple of pre-made meals, but Derek had packed something different. When he opened his container, the smell that emerged made my stomach turn. It was meat, but it didn't smell like any meat I recognized. Raw, gamey, with an underlying sweetness that reminded me of things I didn't want to think about. "Jesus, Derek, what is that?" "Just dinner." He took a large bite, chewing slowly, his eyes never leaving my face. "Want some?" "I'll stick with my own food, thanks." He shrugged and continued eating, making small satisfied sounds that raised the hair on the back of my neck. When he was finished, he licked his fingers clean with exaggerated thoroughness. Night fell like a curtain dropping. One moment, there was still a hint of twilight filtering through the trees, and the next, we were surrounded by absolute darkness. Our small fire provided the only light, creating a tiny bubble of warmth and visibility in an ocean of black. "Tell me something," Derek said suddenly, staring into the flames. "Have you ever been really hungry? I mean, truly, desperately hungry?" "I guess not," I said, thinking about it. "Not like starving hungry." "I have." His voice was barely above a whisper. "It changes you, makes you understand things you never understood before, about what you're willing to do, what you're willing to become." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but something about his tone warned me not to. Instead, I fed another stick to the fire and tried to change the subject. "Remember that camping trip we took in Vermont, when you caught that huge trout?" Derek turned to look at me. and in the firelight, his eyes seemed to reflect the flames in a way that wasn't quite human. "I remember a lot of things differently now," he said. As the night deepened, the wrongness I'd been feeling all day intensified. The darkness beyond our fire seemed alive, pressing against our small circle of light with an almost physical weight. I found myself checking and rechecking the shadows, sure I could see movement at the edge of my vision. Derek sat perfectly still, staring into the fire with an intensity that made me nervous. He hadn't blinked in what felt like minutes, and his breathing had become slow and deliberate, almost like he was meditating. "Maybe we should get some sleep," I suggested. "Sleep?" Derek's head turned toward me with a sharp, jerky movement. "Why would I want to sleep? The night is when everything becomes clear." "Derek, you're starting to freak me out, man." He laughed, but it wasn't his laugh. The sound was higher, more broken, with an edge that made my teeth ache. "Freak you out? Oh, Michael, we haven't even started yet." That's when I first heard the sound that would haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. It came from somewhere in the darkness beyond the trees, a low, keening wail that seemed to go on forever. It wasn't quite human and wasn't quite animal, but it was definitely alive and definitely aware of us. Derek's head snapped toward the sound with predatory alertness. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. "What the hell was that?" "That," Derek said, rising slowly to his feet, "is dinner calling." Before I could ask what he meant, Derek walked away from the fire and disappeared into the darkness. Not toward our tents, not toward the river, but straight into the forest where the sound had come from. "Derek," I called after him, "where are you going?" No answer. I grabbed a flashlight and started to follow, but something made me stop at the edge of our firelight. Every instinct I had was screaming at me not to go into those woods, not to leave the safety of the fire. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, calling Derek's name and getting no response except the echo of my own voice. Finally, I retreated to my tent, zipped it closed, and lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest. But they weren't normal sounds anymore. I heard things moving through the underbrush, large things that didn't care about making noise. I heard voices in the distance, too far away to make out words but close enough to know they weren't human. And underneath it all, I heard Derek laughing. I must have dozed off eventually because I woke to Derek shaking my tent. "Rise and shine, buddy." Pale morning light filtered through the tent fabric. I unzipped the door and squinted up at Derek, who was crouched beside my tent, fully dressed and smiling. "Where did you go last night?" I asked. "Go? I never went anywhere. I slept like a baby." But his clothes were covered in dirt and what looked like dried blood. His fingernails were caked with something dark, and there were scratches on his face and hands that definitely hadn't been there the day before. "Derek, you're bleeding." He touched one of the scratches on his cheek and examined the blood on his fingertip. Then, to my horror, he licked it clean. "Just ran into some thorns in the dark when I went to take a piss. No big deal." I wanted to call him out on the lie. I'd seen him walk straight into the forest, but something about his expression warned me not to. His smile was too wide, showing too many teeth, and his eyes had a flat, predatory quality that made me think of a shark. We broke camp quickly. Derek seemed energized, almost manic, humming tunelessly as he stuffed his gear into his pack. But his movements were wrong somehow. Too quick, too fluid, like he was fighting against his own joints. "So, what's the plan for today?" I asked as we shouldered our packs. "I thought we'd go off trail," Derek said, consulting a map I'd never seen before. "There's something I want to show you." "Off trail? Derek, that's not safe. We could get lost." "Trust me," he said, and his smile grew even wider. "I know exactly where we're going." We left the established trail after about an hour of hiking, following what Derek claimed was an old logging road. But if it had ever been a road, nature had reclaimed it completely. We pushed through dense undergrowth and climbed over fallen logs, making maybe a mile an hour. Derek navigated with complete confidence, never checking his compass or consulting the map. He led us deeper into a part of the forest I'd never seen before, where the trees grew so thick that very little sunlight reached the ground. "How do you know where you're going?" I asked again. "I can smell it," Derek said without turning around. "Smell what?" "Home." That made no sense, but when I tried to question him further, Derek just kept walking. His pace had increased throughout the morning, and I was struggling to keep up. My friend had always been in good shape, but this was different. He moved through the forest like he belonged there, like he was part of it. We stopped for lunch in a small clearing surrounded by massive pine trees. The silence here was absolute. No bird songs, no insect noise, nothing. Even the wind seemed to avoid this place. Derek pulled out another container of that awful-smelling meat and began eating with obvious relish. This time I could see what it was, and my stomach turned. It looked like strips of something that had been torn rather than cut, red and raw with white fat marbled through it. "Derek, what the hell are you eating?" "Protein," he said between bites. "Want some? You look hungry." I wasn't hungry at all. In fact, the sight and smell of his meal had killed my appetite completely. But Derek kept chewing and watching me with those flat, predatory eyes, and I found myself unable to look away. That's when I noticed his teeth. They were different, sharper. The canines had grown longer and more pronounced, and when he smiled, I could see that his molars had developed jagged edges like a predator's. How was that possible? Teeth don't change overnight. "Derek," I said carefully, "I think we should head back to the trail. I'm not feeling great." "Oh, but we're so close now." He stood and shouldered his pack, leaving the remainder of his meal scattered on the ground. "Just a little further." I had no choice but to follow. We were miles from any marked trail, and Derek was the only one who knew the way out. But every step took us deeper into a part of the forest that felt fundamentally wrong. The trees here were different, twisted and gnarled, with bark that looked almost black. Fungi covered many of the trunks in patches that looked disturbingly like diseased skin. And the smell. There was an underlying odor of decay that grew stronger the farther we walked. After another hour of hiking, we emerged into a large clearing that shouldn't have existed. It was perfectly circular, maybe 100 yards across, with not a single tree or bush growing within its boundaries. The ground was bare dirt, packed hard as concrete, and scattered across it were bones. Lots of bones. "Welcome home," Derek said, dropping his pack. I stood at the edge of the clearing, afraid to step inside. The bones weren't old. Some still had scraps of flesh clinging to them. I could see ribs, leg bones, skulls. Some looked like animals, but others... "Derek, we need to leave. Right now." "Leave?" He turned to face me, and I saw that his transformation was accelerating. His face had become gaunt, the skin stretched tight over prominent cheekbones. His fingers had grown longer, ending in what looked like claws. "But you just got here." "You're sick, man. We need to get you to a hospital." Derek laughed that broken, inhuman laugh. "Sick? I've never felt better in my life. I've never felt more alive." He walked to the center of the clearing and sat down cross-legged among the bones. "Do you know what this place is, Michael? This is where they came to feed. The old ones. The ones who understood what hunger really means. Who came to feed? The wendigo." He said the word like a prayer. "The winter cannibals. The ones who learned to appreciate the true sweetness of human flesh." I took a step backward, my hand instinctively moving to the bear spray on my belt. "Derek, you're scaring me." "Good. Fear makes the meat taste better." That's when he stood up and I realized he was no longer entirely human. His proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with arms that hung nearly to his knees. His face had stretched into something lupine, and when he smiled I could see rows of sharp teeth designed for tearing flesh. "The hunger started months ago," he said, his voice now a harsh whisper. "At first I thought it was just stress, but it grew stronger every day. I started craving things I shouldn't crave, started dreaming about things I shouldn't dream about." He began walking toward me with slow, deliberate steps. I fought it for a while, tried to ignore it, but then I found this place. I was hiking alone, got turned around, and somehow ended up here. And I understood. This is where I belong. This is what I'm meant to be. I turned and ran. The forest exploded around me as I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my face and clothes. Behind me, I could hear Derek, or the thing that had been Derek, laughing and giving chase, but he wasn't running. He was flowing, moving through the trees like a shadow, always just at the edge of my vision. I ran for what felt like hours, my lungs burning and my legs cramping, but no matter which direction I went, I couldn't find the trail. The forest seemed to shift around me, paths appearing and disappearing, landmarks changing when I wasn't looking directly at them. Finally, exhausted and lost, I collapsed beside a fallen log to catch my breath. The forest around me was silent except for my ragged breathing. Too silent. I pulled out my compass, but the needle spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. That's when I heard Derek calling my name. "Michael, where are you, buddy?" His voice sounded normal again, concerned and friendly. For a moment, I almost believed that everything I'd seen had been some kind of hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. "I'm sorry I scared you," Derek called from somewhere in the trees. "I don't know what came over me. I think I'm having some kind of breakdown." I wanted to believe him. God, how I wanted to believe him. But something about his voice was off. It was too perfect, too much like the old Derek, as if something was trying to imitate him and overcompensating. "Please, Michael, I need help. I think I'm really sick." I stayed hidden behind the log, barely breathing. The voice was getting closer. "I found some others who can help us. They're friends, Michael. They want to meet you." Others? What others? We were miles from any other human beings. "They're hungry too. Michael, we're all so very, very hungry." The voice was directly behind me now. I risked a glance over the log and saw Derek standing about 20 feet away. But it wasn't Derek anymore. The thing wearing his face was 8 feet tall and skeletal, with arms that hung to its knees and fingers that ended in yellowed claws. Its skin was pale and waxy, stretched tight over visible bones. And its eyes were the color of old blood, and they were looking directly at me. "Found you," it said in Derek's voice. I rolled away from the log just as those claws raked through the bark where my head had been. The creature moved with impossible speed, but I had adrenaline on my side. I sprinted through the trees, branches slapping my face and roots trying to trip me. Behind me, the Derek thing let out a howl that made my bones ache. It was answered by other howls from different directions. Multiple voices, all hungry, all hunting. I ran until my legs gave out, stumbling into a small stream that I followed downhill, hoping it would lead me back to civilization. The water was ice cold and tasted wrong, metallic, with an underlying sweetness that reminded me of Derek's awful meals. Darkness was falling again, and I had no choice but to find shelter. I discovered a small cave formed by several large boulders and crawled inside, pulling my sleeping bag tight around me. I didn't dare light a fire or use my flashlight. I just sat in the absolute darkness and listened. They were out there. I could hear them moving through the forest, calling to each other in voices that weren't quite human. Sometimes they called my name, using Derek's voice or other voices I almost recognized. Sometimes they made sounds that no human throat could produce. As the night wore on, I began to understand that this wasn't just about Derek. This was something bigger, older. The clearing, the bones, the wrongness I'd felt since we arrived. This was a place where something had been feeding for a very long time. I dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound. Sometime near dawn, I heard footsteps approaching my hiding place. Slow, careful steps that stopped just outside the cave. "Michael?" Derek's voice, soft and concerned. "Are you in there? I'm okay now. Whatever happened to me, it's past. I found the trail. I can get us out of here." I didn't move. I barely breathed. "I know you're in there, Michael. I can smell you." The voice changed slightly, becoming harder, hungrier. "I can smell your fear. It smells delicious." Something scraped against the rocks outside the cave, those claws trying to find a way in. "You can't hide forever, Michael. And when you come out, we'll be waiting. All of us. The old hunger never dies. It just finds new hosts." The scraping stopped. Footsteps retreated into the forest. I waited until full daylight before emerging from the cave. The forest looked different in the morning light. Less threatening, more like a normal wilderness. But I knew the danger was still there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for darkness to return. I followed the stream downhill, moving as quickly as I dared. My compass still wouldn't work, but streams always lead to bigger streams, which lead to rivers, which lead to civilization. It was my only hope. By afternoon, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world: car engines. The stream had led me to a road, and a road meant people, safety, a way out of this nightmare. I flagged down the first car I saw, a Forest Service pickup truck. The ranger who stopped was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a concerned expression. "Are you all right?" she asked, taking in my torn clothes and wild appearance. "I need help," I said. "My friend. Something happened to my friend." She radioed for backup and drove me to the ranger station, where I tried to explain what had happened. I told them about Derek's transformation, about the clearing full of bones, about the things hunting me through the forest. I could see the skepticism in their eyes, the way they exchanged glances when they thought I wasn't looking. "Exposure and exhaustion can cause hallucinations," one of them explained gently. "We see it sometimes with hikers who get lost in panic." They organized a search for Derek, and I led them back into the wilderness. But I couldn't find the clearing. We hiked for 2 days, covering grid patterns through every part of the forest I thought we'd visited. We found our original campsite by the river, and Derek's tent was still there, untouched. But there was no sign of him, no trace of where he'd gone. The search continued for a week before they called it off. Derek Martinez was officially listed as missing, presumed dead. The official report stated that he'd likely fallen into a ravine or been attacked by a bear. His body was never found. I tried to return to my normal life, but nothing was normal anymore. I'd see Derek's face in crowds, hear his voice calling my name in the darkness. I started losing weight, unable to stomach most foods. Red meat especially made me nauseous. The smell reminded me too much of what Derek had been eating. The dreams were the worst part. Every night I'd find myself back in that clearing, surrounded by bones and watching shapes move through the trees. Sometimes Derek was there, beckoning me to join him. Sometimes I was the one with claws and an insatiable hunger. 3 months after Derek disappeared, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. "Hello, Michael." Derek's voice, clear as day. "Derek? Where are you? Everyone thinks you're dead." "Dead?" That broken laugh I remembered so well. "I've never been more alive. The hunger has made me strong, Michael. Stronger than I ever imagined possible. Derek, please, come home. We can get you help." "Help? I don't need help anymore. I've found my purpose. We all have. We? There are more of us now. The hunger spreads, Michael. It finds those who are ready, those who understand what they're truly capable of, and it's growing stronger." The line went quiet for a moment. Then Derek spoke again. "You felt it too, didn't you? In the forest. That first taste of understanding. The hunger is patient, Michael. It can wait. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? Haven't you been having the dreams? Haven't you been wondering what it would taste like?" I hung up, but I knew he was right. The dreams were getting stronger, more vivid. And sometimes, late at night when I was walking past a restaurant or a crowded street, I'd catch myself breathing deeply and thinking about things I shouldn't think about. Derek called again a week later, then again a month after that. Each time, his voice sounded less human, more like the thing I'd encountered in the forest. and each time the hunger he described seemed a little less repulsive, a little more understandable. The final call came on a cold December night, almost a year after our camping trip. "It's time, Michael," Derek said. "The winter is here, and the hunger is strongest when the snow falls. Come back to the forest. Come home." "I'm not like you," I said, but even as I spoke the words, I wasn't sure I believed them. "Aren't you? Look at yourself, Michael. Really look. When was the last time you ate a full meal? When was the last time you felt satisfied by normal food?" I looked down at my hands, thin and pale, with fingernails that seemed longer and sharper than they used to be. In the mirror across the room, my reflection stared back with eyes that seemed too bright, too hungry. "The transformation has already begun," Derek said softly. "You can fight it, starve yourself, deny what you're becoming, or you can embrace it. Join us. Feed the hunger properly." I'm writing this now because I can feel it happening. The change Derek went through, the same thing that happened to him in those months before our trip. My teeth are different, my appetites are changing, and the dreams, God, the dreams are becoming clearer every night. I know what I should do. I should check myself into a hospital, tell them about the hunger, let them sedate me until it passes. But I also know it won't pass. This isn't a disease that can be cured. It's an evolution, a becoming. Derek was right about one thing. The winter is here and the hunger is strongest when the snow falls. Every news report about missing hikers, every story about someone disappearing in the wilderness, makes me wonder if they found their way to that clearing, to that place where the old hunger waits. Sometimes I catch myself planning a return trip to the Pemigewasset wilderness. I tell myself it's to find closure, to understand what really happened to Derek. But I know the truth. I'm planning to go back because something there is calling to me, pulling me toward a transformation I'm no longer sure I want to resist. The wendigo isn't just a monster from old stories. It's a hunger that lives in the dark places of the wilderness, waiting for those who are ready to embrace what humanity was before civilization taught us to deny our deepest appetites. And I think I'm almost ready. The snow started falling tonight, and I can hear Derek calling my name in the wind. Soon, very soon, I'll pack my hiking gear one more time and drive north to New Hampshire. But this time, I won't be coming back. At least, not as the person who's writing these words. The hunger is patient, but it's also persistent. And in the end, it always wins. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in Crawford Notch, New Hampshire, deep in the White Mountain National Forest, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day hiking trip with my best friend, David Jones. David and I had been planning this trip for months. We'd both been grinding through 60-hour work weeks at our accounting firm in Boston, and the stress was eating us alive. David especially had been struggling since his divorce finalized in the spring. The bags under his eyes had deepened into permanent shadows, and I'd caught him staring blankly at his computer screen more than once, completely checked out. When I suggested we needed to get away from civilization for a few days, he jumped at the idea with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen from him in years. "Just us, the mountains, and no cell phone service," he'd said, grinning for the first time in months. Like when we were kids. We'd grown up together in rural Vermont, spending summers exploring the woods behind David's family farm. But that was 20 years ago, and we were both soft now, city dwellers who considered a walk to Starbucks exercise. Still, the Appalachian Trail through Crawford Notch seemed manageable. Well-marked paths, established campsites, and rescue services if something went wrong. We should have known better. The first sign something was off came at the trailhead parking lot on Friday morning. The ranger station was supposed to be open, but the windows were dark and a handwritten sign on the door read, "Closed indefinitely." The parking lot, which should have been busy with other hikers on a perfect October weekend, was completely empty except for our rented Jeep. "Weird," David muttered, adjusting his pack straps. "Maybe there's some kind of maintenance going on." I pulled out my phone to check for any Park Service alerts, but there was no signal. Not even one bar. That wasn't unusual this deep in the mountains, but something about the absolute silence felt wrong. No birds singing, no rustling in the underbrush, nothing. Just the sound of our boots on gravel and David's slightly labored breathing. "You sure you're up for this?" I asked. David had insisted on carrying the heavier pack despite being 30 pounds overweight and nursing a bad knee from a skiing accident the previous winter. "I'm fine," he snapped, then softened. "Sorry, man. I just really need this. I need to feel like myself again." I understood. The divorce had destroyed him. Sarah had taken half of everything, including their dog, and David had been living in a studio apartment that smelled like takeout containers and despair. This trip was supposed to be his reset button. We started up the Crawford Path, following the white blazes that marked the trail. The autumn foliage was at peak color, brilliant reds and golds that should have been breathtaking. Instead, there was something unsettling about how the colors seemed muted despite the bright sunshine, as if we were looking at them through dirty glass. For the first few miles, we fell into our old rhythm. David told terrible jokes that made me groan, and I shared gossip from the office. But as we climbed higher, the conversation died away. The silence of the forest pressed in around us, broken only by the crunch of dead leaves underfoot and our increasingly heavy breathing. "Jesus, when did I get so out of shape?" David wheezed, stopping to lean against a birch tree. Sweat darkened his shirt despite the cool October air. "We're both feeling it," I said, though truthfully, I felt fine. Better than fine, actually. There was something energizing about being away from fluorescent lights and computer screens, about feeling my muscles work and my lungs fill with clean mountain air. We stopped for lunch at a scenic overlook that should have provided sweeping views of the presidential range. Instead, a low fog had rolled in, turning the world gray and featureless. We sat on a fallen log and ate our sandwiches in silence, the fog swirling around us like living smoke. That's when we heard it for the first time, a sound like wind through bare branches. But there was no wind. The fog hung perfectly still around us, yet that rustling, whisking noise seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "What is that?" David whispered. I strained my ears, but the sound had stopped. "Probably just the fog settling. Sound travels weird in this weather." David nodded, but he kept glancing over his shoulder as we packed up and continued hiking. The trail became steeper and the fog thicker. The white blazes that marked our path seemed to appear and disappear in the gray void like ghosts. I found myself counting steps between markers. 37, 41, 63. The numbers should have been consistent, but they weren't. By late afternoon, we reached our planned campsite at a small clearing beside Gibbs Brook. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing a circle of towering pines that seemed to lean inward like curious giants. The brook gurgled pleasantly over smooth stones, and for the first time all day, I felt the tension leave my shoulders. "This is perfect," David said, dropping his pack with visible relief. I was starting to think we'd never find it. Setting up camp took longer than expected. David's hands shook as he tried to work the tent stakes, and he kept dropping things. I attributed it to exhaustion and took over most of the setup myself. By the time we had the tent secured and our sleeping bags rolled out, the sun was sinking behind the trees. "Want me to get a fire started?" I asked. "God, yes, I'm freezing." The temperature was dropping fast, and our breath had begun to mist. I gathered kindling while David pulled out our camp stove and dinner supplies. The dead wood should have been perfect for burning, dry and seasoned by months of autumn weather. But every match I struck went out immediately, even in the still air. The kindling would catch for a moment, then die as if someone had blown it out. "This is bullshit," I muttered, trying yet another match. "This wood should light instantly." David looked up from where he was struggling with the camp stove. "Mine's not working either. The gas is flowing, but it won't catch." We spent an hour trying to get either the fire or the stove lit. Finally, I managed to coax a few weak flames from the kindling, enough to heat a can of soup over my lighter. We shared it directly from the can, taking turns with a single spoon, like survivors of some disaster. "Remember when we used to camp behind your house?" David asked, his voice dreamy. "We'd build these huge bonfires and cook hot dogs on sticks." "Yeah," I said, though I was only half listening. Something was moving in the tree line, just beyond the edge of our weak firelight. Not an animal. The movement was too purposeful, too patient. Whatever it was seemed to be circling our campsite, always staying just out of sight. "And your mom would bring us s'mores supplies," David continued. She'd always pretend to be annoyed that we were making so much noise, but she loved having us around. She said I was like her second son. I frowned. David's mom had died when we were 12. My mom was the one who used to bring us s'mores supplies. But when I looked at him, his face was peaceful for the first time all day, lit by the dying embers of our pathetic fire. "David," I started, but he held up a hand. "Listen," he whispered. The rustling sound was back, but louder now, and underneath it, something else, a rhythmic tapping, like fingernails on wood, or claws on bark. The fire died completely, plunging us into absolute darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, but the beam seemed weak and sickly, barely penetrating the wall of black around us. David's breathing had become shallow and rapid. "It's just animals," I said, as much to convince myself as him. "Bears, maybe, or deer." But I knew it wasn't. Animals don't move with such deliberate patience. Animals don't circle campsites for hours, staying just out of sight. And animals don't make sounds like the one that came next. A low, keening wail that started human and became something else entirely. David grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave bruises. "We need to leave. Right now. It's the middle of the night in unfamiliar terrain. We'll break our necks trying to hike out in the dark. Then we stay awake, all night, until sunrise." We huddled together in the tent, flashlights clutched in white-knuckled hands, listening to whatever was outside. The sounds came and went, sometimes silence for long minutes, then sudden bursts of movement that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Twice, something large brushed against the tent wall, the fabric bulging inward as if being pressed by a massive hand. Around 3 a.m, David fell asleep despite his terror. I sat guard, fighting to keep my eyes open, jumping at every sound. That's when I heard the voices. They were faint at first, like people talking in the distance. But as I listened, they became clearer. It was David's voice, having a conversation with someone I couldn't hear. Except David was right beside me, unconscious and snoring softly. The David voice outside was telling stories about our childhood, but the details were all wrong. He talked about adventures we'd never had, people we'd never met. He mentioned places in these mountains that didn't exist on any map. And his tone was strange. Too cheerful, too enthusiastic, like a bad actor overplaying a part. I wanted to wake David up, but I was terrified that moving would draw attention to us. So I sat frozen, listening to this wrong version of my best friend chat with invisible companions about impossible memories. The voices stopped at dawn. I must have dozed off despite myself because I woke to find David shaking me gently. "Hey man, sun's up. We should get moving." I blinked at him groggily. His color was better, and he seemed more alert than he had in months. "Did you sleep okay?" "Like a baby. Best sleep I've had in ages." He stretched and yawned. "I had the weirdest dreams, though. I dreamed I was talking to my mom. She said she misses me." My blood went cold. David's mother had been dead for over 20 years, and I'd heard him talking outside our tent for hours. "David, your mom died when we were kids." He laughed. "No, she didn't. What are you talking about? She lives in that little house by the lake. I visit her every Christmas." His expression was genuinely puzzled, as if I'd told him the sky was green. I stared at him, my mind racing. David's mother had died of cancer when we were 12. It had been devastating for him, the first real loss either of us had experienced. His father had moved them to my town afterward, which is how David and I became friends. These weren't details you could forget or confuse. David, think about it. Really think. Where did we meet? At school, he said immediately. 4th grade, Mrs. Henderson's class. No, we met in 7th grade when you moved to my town after your mom died. For just a moment, his confident expression flickered. Something uncertain and afraid flashed across his face. Then it was gone, replaced by that same peaceful smile. You must be thinking of someone else, he said. My mom is fine. She makes the best apple pie. You've had it dozens of times. I wanted to argue further, but something in his tone warned me off. There was a subtle threat underneath the friendliness, like a dog showing its teeth while wagging its tail. We broke camp in silence. David hummed while he packed, a tuneless melody that made my skin crawl. His movements were efficient and purposeful, more coordinated than he'd been the day before. The David I knew was clumsy on his best days, prone to dropping things and tripping over his own feet. This version moved with predatory grace. The fog had lifted, revealing a perfect autumn morning. The trail should have been easy to find, but the white blazes seemed to have multiplied overnight. Instead of following a single marked path, there were blazes leading in all directions, some painted on trees that definitely hadn't been marked the day before. Which way? I asked. David consulted his compass, then pointed confidently toward a path that definitely hadn't existed yesterday. That way. We'll cut across the ridge and pick up the main trail on the other side. Are you sure? I don't remember seeing this trail on the map. Trust me, he said, and that predatory smile flashed again. I know these mountains like the back of my hand. I followed because I didn't know what else to do. The alternative was admitting that my best friend had been replaced by something else overnight, which seemed impossible. People don't just become different people. There had to be a rational explanation. But as we hiked, the wrongness became harder to ignore. David moved tirelessly, his breath never laboring despite the steep terrain. He talked constantly now, sharing memories that became more distorted with each telling. According to him, we'd been hiking these specific mountains since we were children. We'd built a secret fort somewhere up ahead. There was a hidden waterfall where we used to swim. None of it was true, but he told these stories with such conviction that I began to doubt my own memory. Maybe there were things I'd forgotten. Maybe the stress of the past few months had affected me more than I'd realized. The trail David was following didn't appear on my map. We should have intersected with marked paths hours ago, but instead, we seemed to be climbing steadily into unmapped wilderness. The trees grew larger and more ancient, their trunks twisted into shapes that hurt to look at directly. The sunlight, which had been brilliant that morning, became dim and green-filtered, as if we were walking underwater. David, I think we're lost. Lost? He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. We're not lost. We're exactly where we need to be. That's when I saw the bones. They were scattered around the base of a massive oak tree, bleached white by weather and time. Most looked like they came from deer or other large animals, but some were unmistakably human. A skull grinned up at me from a bed of moldering leaves, its jaw hanging open in a perpetual scream. Jesus Christ! I stumbled backward, my heart hammering. David, we need to get out of here. Someone was murdered here. But David was kneeling beside the bones, running his fingers over them with something approaching reverence. Not murdered, he said softly. He fed. These are offerings. Offerings to what? He looked up at me, and for a split second his eyes weren't David's eyes at all. They were yellow and hungry, with pupils that reflected light like an animal's. Then he blinked, and they were normal again. To the mountain, he said simply. To the things that live here. The old things that were here long before people came with their maps and trails and certainty about what's real and what isn't. I was backing away now, my hand fumbling for the knife on my belt. You're not David. Of course I'm David." He stood slowly, his movements fluid and wrong. "I'm your best friend. I'm the boy who shared his lunch with you when you forgot yours. I'm the man who held you when your father died. I'm the person who knows all your secrets." And he did know them. As he talked, he recited details of my life that only David could possibly know. Private moments, embarrassing failures, dreams I'd shared with no one else. But underneath that familiar knowledge was something vast and hungry, something that had been waiting in these mountains for far longer than humans had existed. "What did you do with him?" I whispered. "He's still here," the thing wearing David's face said. "He's part of me now. His memories, his feelings, his love for you, it's all still here, but improved, purified, made eternal." It took a step toward me, and I saw that its feet didn't quite touch the ground. Dead leaves swirled around it without wind, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees in an instant. "You can join us," it continued. "You can be part of something greater than your small, frightened human existence. No more anxiety about deadlines or mortgages or growing old. No more watching your body decay and your mind fail. Just endless hunger and the satisfaction of feeding it." I ran. I crashed through the underbrush like a panicked animal, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. Behind me, I could hear David laughing. But it was wrong. Too deep, echoing from places human voices shouldn't come from. The forest seemed to shift around me as I ran, paths appearing and disappearing, familiar landmarks rearranging themselves like pieces of a malevolent puzzle. I fell dozens of times, rolling down slopes and slamming into trees, but terror kept me moving. My lungs burned and my legs felt like rubber, but I didn't dare stop. The thing that had been David was behind me somewhere, moving without effort through terrain that was trying to kill me. Hours passed. Or maybe minutes. Time felt broken in these woods, flowing backward and forward like a confused river. The sun seemed to be setting and rising simultaneously, casting shadows that pointed in impossible directions. Finally, I burst out of the tree line onto what looked like a real trail, the blessed white blazes of the Appalachian Trail marking the way back to civilization. I followed them downhill at a stumbling run, not caring that my ankle was screaming with every step or that blood was running into my eyes from a gash on my forehead. The parking lot appeared ahead like a mirage. Our rented Jeep sat exactly where we'd left it, surrounded by the cars of other hikers who'd arrived for weekend camping. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that something ancient and hungry was stalking the trails just a few miles away. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit them in the ignition. As the engine started, I looked back toward the trail and saw David standing at the tree line. He looked perfectly normal. My friend, my hiking companion, confused and concerned. He raised a hand and called my name, his voice carrying clearly across the parking lot. Other hikers turned to look, and I realized how I must appear to them. Bloody, wild-eyed, abandoning my friend in the wilderness. "Michael," David called again. "What happened? Are you hurt?" For a moment, I almost believed it had all been some kind of breakdown, a stress-induced hallucination brought on by exhaustion and isolation. David looked so normal, so genuinely worried. The other hikers were staring at me with expressions of concern and judgment. But then I saw his shadow. In the late afternoon sunlight, everyone in the parking lot cast normal human shadows. Everyone except David. His shadow was huge and twisted, with too many limbs and a head that split open to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth. As I watched, frozen in horror, the shadow turned to look directly at me and smiled. I floored the accelerator and didn't stop driving until I reached Boston. That was 3 months ago. I told the police that David had fallen into a ravine and I couldn't find his body. Search and rescue teams scoured Crawford Notch for weeks but found nothing. Eventually, they declared him missing and presumed dead. His ex-wife, Sarah, grieved appropriately. His co-workers sent flowers. Life moved on. But David didn't stay dead. He started showing up places. Never when I was looking directly, but always in my peripheral vision. standing in the back of the subway car during my morning commute, sitting at a corner table in the coffee shop I frequent, walking past my apartment window at night, always smiling that wrong smile, always watching. I moved to a new apartment across town. He found me within a week. I changed jobs, started taking different routes to work, even considered leaving Boston entirely. Nothing worked. He was always there, patient and persistent, waiting for me to come back to him. The worst part is that sometimes I want to. Sometimes, in the darkest hours of sleepless nights, the idea of giving up this exhausting, terrifying existence and joining whatever David has become seems almost appealing. No more fear, no more running, no more looking over my shoulder. Just surrender to something vast and hungry and eternal. But then I remember the bones around that tree. I remember the yellow hunger in his eyes. I remember that David Jones died in those mountains, and whatever wears his face now is just an echo, a lure, a trap. I've started carrying iron in my pockets, old nails and railroad spikes that I bought from an antique dealer who asked no questions. I've learned which churches stay open late and which subway stations have crosses mounted on the walls. I've covered my apartment with mirrors and running water, creating a fortress of superstition and desperate hope. Sometimes it works. Sometimes David's shadow hesitates at thresholds, turns away from reflected surfaces, seems smaller near sources of flowing water. But he's learning, too, adapting, becoming better at wearing human shapes and moving through human spaces. Last night, he knocked on my door. I didn't answer, but I could hear him talking through the thin wood. He told me about the promotion I'd gotten at work, about my sister's pregnancy, about the leak in my bathroom ceiling that I'd been meaning to fix. Intimate details of my current life that no supernatural creature should know. "I miss you," he said, and for a moment his voice was perfectly, heartbreakingly David. We were supposed to be best friends forever. Remember? Blood brothers, through thick and thin. I pressed my back against the door and closed my eyes, fighting the urge to let him in. "I know you're scared," he continued. "I know this seems wrong. But death isn't the end, Michael. It's just a doorway, and I can show you what's on the other side." He stood there for hours, sometimes talking, sometimes just breathing. When dawn came, he finally left, but not before sliding something under my door. A photograph from our childhood that had been in David's wallet when we went hiking. We're maybe 10 years old, grinning at the camera with missing teeth and grass-stained clothes, happy and innocent and unaware of the horrors waiting in the world. On the back, in David's handwriting, it says, "Forever Friends, D&M." I'm writing this down because I know he's going to win eventually. Whatever is wearing David's face is patient and clever and hungry. It knows me better than I know myself because it has all of David's memories, all his love and understanding and intimate knowledge of who I am and what I want. Sooner or later, I'll make a mistake. I'll let my guard down, or my desperation will overwhelm my fear, or I'll simply wear out from the constant vigilance. And when that happens, I'll open a door, or cross a threshold, or accept an invitation, and the thing that used to be my best friend will finally complete whatever transformation began in those mountains. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. Don't go looking for me. Don't go to Crawford Notch. Don't trust anyone who claims to have seen me alive after the date on this document. And if someone wearing my face ever comes to your door, speaking in my voice and knowing things only I could know, don't let them in. No matter how much they plead, no matter how real they seem, no matter how much you miss me. Because I'll be dead, and whatever's standing on your doorstep will just be hungry. The mountains are patient. They've been waiting a long time, and they can wait a little longer. But not forever. Never forever. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the White Mountains of New Hampshire in October of last year, during what was supposed to be a simple weekend hiking trip with my coworkers. The four of us, Jennifer Davis, Robert Johnson, Sarah Rodriguez, and myself, had been planning this trip for months. We worked together at a consulting firm in Boston, and the stress of our jobs had been eating at us all year. Jennifer, our team lead, suggested we needed to disconnect and recharge somewhere far from cell towers and email notifications. The Presidential Traverse seemed perfect, a challenging but manageable hike through some of New Hampshire's most remote wilderness. I should have known something was wrong from the moment we parked at the Appalachian Mountain Club's Pinkham Notch base camp. The parking attendant, a weathered man in his 60s with yellowed teeth and hands that shook slightly, looked at our permits and frowned. "You folks sure about this route?" he asked, tapping our planned path with a gnarled finger. "Been some unusual activity up there lately. Hikers coming down talking about strange sounds, equipment malfunctions." Robert, ever the skeptic, laughed it off. "What kind of strange sounds? Bears? We've got bear spray." The old man's eyes went dark. "Not bears. Something else. Something that makes you hear voices that ain't there. Makes you think your friends are calling to you from the woods when they're standing right beside you." Sarah rolled her eyes. "Local folklore to spook the tourists, right?" But the man wasn't smiling. "Just stick to the marked trails. Don't follow any sounds you can't identify. And if someone in your group starts acting strange, really strange, you get down from that mountain fast." We should have listened. The first day went smoothly enough. We hiked up the Tuckerman Ravine Trail, our packs loaded with 3 days' worth of supplies. The autumn colors were spectacular, reds and golds that seemed to glow in the afternoon light filtering through the canopy. Jennifer kept stopping to take photos with her expensive camera, while Robert complained about the weight of his pack. Sarah, the most experienced hiker among us, set a steady pace that kept us all together. By evening, we'd reached our planned campsite near the Hermit Lake shelters. The temperature was dropping fast. October nights in the White Mountains can be brutal, but we got our tents up and a fire going before full darkness fell. The forest around us was quiet except for the occasional crack of settling wood and the distant call of an owl. "God, this is exactly what I needed," Jennifer said, leaning back against a log and sipping instant coffee from her metal cup. "No emails, no deadlines, just peace." "The fire's nice," Sarah agreed, poking at the flames with a stick, "though it's acting weird. Keep seeing it flicker like there's wind, but there's no wind." I noticed it too. The flames would suddenly gutter and dance as if something had passed between them and us, but the air was perfectly still. When I mentioned it, Robert shrugged. "Probably just downdrafts from the mountain. Fire behaves differently at altitude." But I'd been camping since I was a kid, and I'd never seen flames move like that. They seemed to lean away from us, as if trying to retreat deeper into the darkness beyond our small circle of light. The first night passed without incident, though I woke several times to sounds I couldn't identify. A rhythmic tapping like fingernails on wood, a wet, sliding noise that seemed to circle our campsite, and once what sounded distinctly like someone whispering my name from the direction of the tree line. Each time I sat up to listen, the sounds stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it made my ears ring. The second day, we broke camp early and continued up toward Mount Washington's summit. The trail grew steeper and more challenging, winding through stands of stunted spruce and fir trees that seemed to press closer together as we climbed. The canopy above us thickened until only scattered patches of gray sky were visible. That's when the GPS died. "That's impossible," Sarah said, frowning at her device. "I just charged this thing. It was at full battery when we started this morning." Jennifer pulled out her phone. Dead. Robert's hiking watch, which had been tracking our progress perfectly, showed nothing but a blank screen. "Electronics malfunction at altitude sometimes," I offered, though I was starting to feel a creeping unease. "Good thing we brought paper maps." But when Robert unfolded his topographic map, we all stared in confusion. The trail markings looked wrong. Paths that should have been clearly marked were missing, and new trails appeared that led in directions that made no geographical sense. "This has to be an old map," Jennifer said, but when we checked the date, it was the current year's edition. Maybe we took a wrong turn somewhere, Sarah suggested, though she sounded uncertain. She was the most experienced navigator among us, and I'd never known her to make that kind of mistake. We decided to press on, following what we thought was the correct trail based on our collective memory and the sun's position. But as the hours passed, the landscape around us seemed to shift in subtle ways. Trees that I was certain we'd passed before appeared again and again, as if we were walking in circles. A distinctive granite boulder kept showing up on our left, then our right, then ahead of us, despite the fact that we were supposedly climbing in a straight line. By late afternoon, we were all thoroughly rattled. "We need to find a place to set up camp," Sarah said, her voice tight with controlled anxiety. "Figure out where we are in the morning when we can see better." We found a small clearing surrounded by dense pines, barely large enough for our 4 tents. As we set up camp, I noticed that the trees around us seemed to form an almost perfect circle, their trunks leaning inward at unnatural angles. The ground in the center of the clearing was bare earth, packed hard as if countless feet had walked the same path over and over. "This place gives me the creeps," Jennifer muttered, struggling with her tent stakes. The ground was so hard she could barely drive them in. "It's just a clearing," Robert said, but I noticed he kept glancing over his shoulder at the tree line. The fire proved even more problematic than the night before. We'd brought plenty of dry tinder and seasoned wood, but the flames kept guttering out for no apparent reason. When we finally got a small blaze going, it burned with an odd, greenish tint that cast strange shadows on the surrounding trees. "Must be something in the wood," Sarah said, but she didn't sound convinced. As darkness fell, the forest around us came alive with sounds. Not the normal sounds of woodland creatures, owls, insects, the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. These were different, deliberate. The crack of heavy footsteps circling our campsite, the scrape of something large being dragged across the forest floor, and underneath it all, a low humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Are you guys hearing this?" Jennifer whispered, clutching her camping mug so tightly her knuckles were white. We all nodded. The sounds were impossible to ignore, but also impossible to identify. Every time one of us grabbed a flashlight to investigate, the sounds would stop. The moment we relaxed, they'd start again, always from a different direction. "Bears," Robert said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Has to be bears." "Bears don't hum," Sarah replied grimly. Around midnight, the humming stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise had been. It felt heavy, expectant, like the moment before a thunderclap. We sat frozen around our dying fire, straining to hear anything that might tell us what was out there in the darkness. That's when Jennifer stood up. "I'm going to get more wood," she announced. "What? No." Sarah grabbed her arm. "Are you insane? Don't go out there." Jennifer looked down at her with a confused expression. "We need more wood for the fire. I saw a good dead branch just past those trees." She pointed toward the darkest part of the forest. "Jen, there's plenty of wood right here," I said, indicating the pile we'd gathered earlier. "You don't need to." But she was already walking away, her movements stiff and mechanical. She moved toward the tree line like she was being pulled by invisible strings. "Jennifer," Robert called, scrambling to his feet. "Come back." She didn't respond. She didn't even turn around. She just kept walking until the darkness swallowed her completely. We waited by the fire, calling her name and shining our flashlights into the woods. After 20 minutes with no response, we decided to go after her. Sarah suggested we stay together, but the forest seemed to swallow our flashlight beams after just a few feet. The trees were so dense that we had to walk single file, and within minutes we'd lost sight of our campfire. "Jennifer," I shouted, my voice echoing strangely in the thick air. "Where are you?" No answer. We searched for over an hour, calling her name until our voices were hoarse, but the forest seemed to eat our words, and the only response was the echo of our own desperation bouncing back from the trees. Finally, exhausted and terrified, we made our way back to camp using Robert's compass. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the clearing felt even smaller and more enclosed than before. "We have to contact the authorities," Sarah said, pulling out her satellite communicator. But like everything else electronic we'd brought, it was dead. The screen wouldn't even turn on. "In the morning," Robert said, though he looked as shaken as the rest of us. "We'll hike down at first light and get help." None of us slept. We huddled around the dying fire, starting at every sound, waiting for dawn. The humming had returned, louder now, and it seemed to be coming from directly beneath our feet. Sometimes I swore I could feel the ground vibrating with it. As the sky began to lighten, we heard footsteps approaching through the trees. Slow, measured steps that crunched through the fallen leaves. "Jennifer," Sarah called hopefully. The footsteps stopped just beyond the tree line. Then Jennifer's voice drifted through the morning mist. "I found the wood." She emerged from the forest carrying an armload of branches, but something was wrong. Her movements were too fluid, too graceful. She glided rather than walked, her feet barely seeming to touch the ground. Her hair, which had been pulled back in a practical ponytail when she left, now hung loose around her shoulders. And her eyes. Her eyes were completely black. "Where have you been?" Robert demanded, relief and anger warring in his voice. "We've been looking for you all night." Jennifer tilted her head at an unnatural angle, like a bird studying a worm. "I was getting wood, like I said." Her voice was flat, emotionless, missing all the warmth and inflection that made her Jennifer. "You've been gone for 8 hours," Sarah said slowly. "We searched everywhere." "Have I?" Jennifer's lips curved in a smile that was too wide, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than they should be. "Time moves differently in the deep woods." She dropped the wood by the fire pit. The branches were pale and smooth, completely devoid of bark. They looked almost like bones. "Jen, are you feeling okay?" I asked, studying her face. "You look different." "I feel wonderful," she replied, still wearing that unsettling smile. "Better than I have in years. The forest showed me things, Michael. Beautiful, terrible things. It showed me what we really are underneath all our pretense and civilization." "What kind of things?" Sarah asked, but there was fear in her voice. "Hungry things," Jennifer whispered. "So very, very hungry." She knelt by the fire pit and began arranging the bone-white branches. The moment they touched the dying embers, they burst into flame, but the fire was wrong. Instead of the warm orange and red of a normal campfire, these flames burned cold and blue, casting everything in a sickly, phosphorescent light. "Jesus Christ," Robert breathed, backing away from the fire. "What is that?" Jennifer looked up at him, and I saw that her black eyes reflected the blue flames like mirrors. "Fuel," she said simply. That's when I knew we had to run. "Pack up," I told Sarah and Robert quietly. "Right now. Leave anything that's not essential." But Jennifer heard me. Her head snapped around with inhuman speed and she fixed me with those terrible black eyes. "Leaving so soon, Michael? But we haven't eaten yet." The way she said eaten made my blood freeze. There was hunger in her voice. Not the normal hunger of someone who'd missed a meal, but something deeper and more primal. Something that viewed us not as friends, but as food. Sarah and Robert were already moving, stuffing essential items into their packs. Jennifer watched them with apparent amusement, making no move to stop them. But as we prepared to leave the clearing, she stood and blocked the only exit. "I really think you should stay," she said, and her voice had taken on an odd, hypnotic quality. "The forest has so much to show you, so much to teach you about hunger, about need, about what it means to truly feed." "Get out of the way, Jen," Robert said, trying to sound firm. But his voice shook. Jennifer laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. This isn't Jennifer anymore. Jennifer was weak, soft. She couldn't appreciate what she was being offered. But I can. I can taste your fear, your confusion. It's delicious. She took a step toward us, and I saw that her fingernails had grown into claws. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and dark veins were visible beneath the surface like a network of black roots. "What are you?" Sarah whispered. "Hungry," Jennifer, or the thing wearing Jennifer's face, replied. "Always so hungry. The forest feeds me now, but it's not enough. I need more. I need warm blood, fresh meat. I need to hear screaming." That's when Robert made his move. He feinted left, then dove right, trying to get past her to the trail. But the Jennifer thing moved faster than anything human should be able to move. Her clawed hand lashed out and caught him across the chest, tearing through his jacket and the flesh beneath like it was tissue paper. Robert screamed and fell, blood pouring from 4 parallel gashes. The Jennifer thing leaned over him, inhaling deeply. "Oh, that smells wonderful," she said. "Fear and pain and desperation. It's been so long since I've tasted anything so fresh." Sarah grabbed a burning branch from the fire and swung it at the creature, but it caught the makeshift weapon in one hand without flinching. The flames didn't seem to affect it at all. Now, it said, still wearing Jennifer's face but speaking in a voice like grinding stone. "Don't spoil my fun. I want to savor this." I helped Robert to his feet. He was bleeding badly, but he could still move. While the creature was focused on Sarah, I guided him toward a gap in the trees that might lead back to the main trail. "Can you run?" I whispered. He nodded, though his face was pale from blood loss. "On 3. 1. 2. We bolted. Behind us, the Jennifer thing let out a howl that didn't sound remotely human. It was the sound a wolf might make if wolves could feel rage and betrayal, and an all-consuming hunger that gnawed at their very souls. The forest blurred past us as we ran. Branches whipped at our faces, roots tried to trip us, and the terrain seemed to shift beneath our feet like something alive. But we kept running, driven by pure terror and the sound of pursuit behind us. The thing that had been Jennifer didn't move like a human anymore. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush with impossible speed, snapping branches as thick as my arm like they were twigs. Sometimes it would let out that horrible howl, and sometimes it would call to us in Jennifer's voice, "Michael, Sarah, where are you going? Come back. I promise I'll make it quick." But underneath Jennifer's familiar tones was something else, something ancient and hungry and utterly inhuman. We ran for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than 20 or 30 minutes. Robert was slowing down, leaving a trail of blood that I knew the creature would be able to follow easily. Sarah had fallen behind, her shorter legs struggling to keep up with our panicked pace. Finally, we emerged onto what looked like the main trail. I could see trail markers nailed to the trees, and the path was wide and well-maintained. Hope flared in my chest. "This way," I gasped, pointing down the mountain. "If we can get to the road." That's when we heard Sarah scream. I turned to see the Jennifer thing dragging her back into the forest. Sarah was fighting desperately, clawing at the ground, but the creature was impossibly strong. Her fingers left furrows in the dirt as she was pulled away. "Help me," she screamed. "Please don't leave me." Robert grabbed my arm. "We have to go," he said, blood still seeping through his jacket. "We can't fight that thing. We have to get help." I knew he was right, but the sound of Sarah's screams followed us as we stumbled down the trail. They grew fainter and fainter until they were swallowed by the forest entirely. Then there was only silence. We made it to the parking area just as the sun was setting. The same old attendant was still there, locking up the visitor center. When he saw us, bloody, terrified, stumbling out of the woods like refugees, his expression didn't show surprise. It showed recognition. "How many?" he asked quietly. "2, I managed to say. "Something took 2 of them." He nodded grimly. "Wendigo's been active up there for months. Takes hikers, wears their faces, tries to lure others deeper into the woods. You're lucky you got out." "Wendigo?" Robert stared at him. That's just a legend." "Is it?" The old man looked up at the mountain, its peaks disappearing into gathering darkness. Every few years, something wakes up in those woods, something that's always been there, waiting. It gets hungry, and it starts taking people. Usually takes the whole group, but sometimes, he shrugged, sometimes a few get away to tell the tale. We have to call the police, I said. Send a search and rescue team. Already called them, he replied, showing us his radio. But they won't find anything. Never do. The wendigo's good at hiding its kills. Makes it look like accidents, animal attacks, people just vanishing into thin air. The search and rescue teams found no trace of Jennifer or Sarah. The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead due to exposure or animal attack. Robert and I told our story to the authorities, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. 2 traumatized survivors, probably suffering from exposure and shock, making up stories about supernatural creatures to explain the loss of their friends. Robert never fully recovered from his injuries. The wounds on his chest healed, but they left deep scars that reminded him daily of what we'd seen. He quit his job a month later and moved across the country. We stayed in touch for a while, but talking about what happened just made it worse for both of us. I still work at the same consulting firm, though I can't focus the way I used to. The office feels too bright, too safe, too removed from the real world. Sometimes I catch myself staring out the window at the distant hills, wondering what's out there in the darkness between the trees. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear Jennifer's voice calling my name from somewhere far away. But it's not really Jennifer anymore, and it never will be. It's something wearing her voice like a mask, something that remembers just enough about being human to know exactly how to hurt the people who loved her. The wendigo is still out there in the White Mountains, waiting for the next group of hikers who think they're tough enough to handle whatever the wilderness can throw at them. It's patient, it's cunning, and it's always hungry. I've never been camping since, and I never will again. Some fears change you at a fundamental level. Rewire your brain so completely that you can never be the same person you were before. Every time I see a forest, every time I smell pine needles or wood smoke, I'm back in that clearing with those bone-white branches burning blue in the darkness. The thing that took Jennifer and Sarah is still out there, and sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if it's still wearing their faces. My name is Michael Williams, and I survived something that shouldn't exist. But survival isn't the same as escape. Some things follow you home, take up residence in your dreams, whisper to you in the small hours of the morning when the world is quiet and dark. The wendigo taught me that there are hungers that can never be satisfied, and some of them wear the faces of people we love. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness near Mount Isolation in New Hampshire's Presidential Range, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day hiking trip that became the most terrifying experience of my life. Robert Johnson had been my best friend since college, and we'd been planning this trip for months. Rob was the kind of guy who could make you laugh even when everything was falling apart. Quick with a joke, always optimistic, the type who'd give you his last granola bar without thinking twice. We'd hiked together dozens of times before, but never anywhere this isolated. Mount Isolation earned its name honestly. It sits deep in the dry river wilderness, miles from the nearest trail junction, accessible only by a grueling 8-mile hike through dense forest and rocky terrain. We parked at the tiny dry river campground off Route 302 early Friday morning. The October air was crisp, carrying the smell of dying leaves and the promise of winter. I remember feeling excited as we shouldered our packs, mine a sensible blue, Rob's an obnoxious orange that he claimed would help rescue teams find his body if he died out there. We both laughed at that. We had no idea how prophetic his joke would prove to be. The first day passed without incident. We followed the dry river trail for several miles before branching off onto the less maintained Mount Isolation Trail. The path was narrow and overgrown, forcing us to push through low-hanging branches and step carefully over moss-covered rocks. By late afternoon, we'd reached our planned campsite, a small clearing about 2 miles from the summit, nestled between towering spruce trees that blocked out most of the sky. "This place gives me the creeps," Rob said as we set up our tents, but he was grinning when he said it. "Feels like we're being watched." I laughed it off, though I'd felt the same thing. There was something about the silence here that felt wrong. Not peaceful, but oppressive. The usual forest sounds seemed muted, as if the trees were absorbing every noise. Even our voices sounded flat and dead. We made dinner over a small camp stove, freeze-dried pasta that tasted like cardboard but filled our stomachs. As darkness fell, we built a fire from deadfall and settled in for the evening. The flames danced cheerfully, casting flickering shadows on the trees around us, and for a while the oppressive feeling lifted. "Remember that time in college when you got us lost in the Adirondacks?" Rob asked, poking the fire with a stick. "We ended up sleeping under that highway overpass because you insisted you knew a shortcut." "That was your fault," I protested. "You're the one who said we should follow that deer trail." We talked and laughed until nearly midnight, the fire gradually burning down to glowing coals. The temperature was dropping fast. I could see my breath in the firelight. We were both tired from the day's hike and decided to turn in. "Night, Mike," Rob called from his tent, the orange fabric glowing faintly in the moonlight. "Night, Rob." I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the silence. It was absolute. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant highway noise. Just my own breathing and heartbeat. Gradually, exhaustion took over and I drifted off to sleep. I woke to Rob screaming. The sound ripped through the night like a siren, a raw, animalistic shriek that made my blood turn to ice. I shot upright in my sleeping bag, heart hammering, completely disoriented. The scream came again, closer this time, definitely Rob's voice but twisted with such terror and agony that I barely recognized it. "Rob!" I shouted, fumbling for my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating my tent walls but nothing beyond. "Rob!" Silence. I unzipped my tent as fast as my shaking hands would allow and crawled outside. The air was brutally cold, probably in the 20s, and my breath came out in thick clouds. I swept my flashlight across the campsite, the beam trembling with my hands. Rob's tent was empty. The orange fabric hung limp and still, the front flap hanging open like a gaping mouth. I scrambled over to it, dreading what I might find inside. The tent was undisturbed, sleeping bag still spread out, his pack sitting in the corner exactly where he'd left it. But Rob was gone. No signs of struggle, no torn fabric, nothing. It was as if he'd simply vanished into thin air. "Rob!" I screamed into the darkness. "Where are you?" My voice echoed off the mountains and died away, leaving only that horrible, oppressive silence. I stood there in my underwear and boots, flashlight beam dancing frantically across the trees, feeling smaller and more helpless than I'd ever felt in my life. I spent the next 3 hours searching. I called his name until my throat was raw, swept every inch of the clearing with my flashlight, even checked the nearby stream in case he'd fallen in. Nothing. It was as if my best friend had been erased from existence. As dawn broke gray and cold over the mountains, I sat by the dead remains of our fire, trying to think rationally. People don't just disappear. Maybe Rob had gotten up to use the bathroom and gotten disoriented in the dark. Maybe he'd fallen and hit his head. Maybe he was lying injured somewhere just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I made coffee on the camp stove with shaking hands and forced myself to eat an energy bar, though it tasted like sawdust. I needed to stay strong, stay focused. Rob was depending on me. By full daylight, I'd expanded my search in wider and wider circles around the campsite. I found his footprints leading to a tree about 50 yards from his tent. The bark was scarred where he'd apparently relieved himself. But beyond that tree, the tracks simply stopped. Not like they'd been covered up or blown away by wind. They just ended. As if Rob had walked to that tree and then been lifted into the air. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be an explanation. Maybe an animal had attacked him and dragged the body away. Maybe he'd been sleepwalking and fallen into a ravine. But deep down, I knew something unnatural had happened here. I could feel it in the wrongness of the silence, in the way the shadows seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I was packing up to hike out and get help when I heard his voice. "Mike? Mike, where are you?" It was definitely Rob's voice, calling from somewhere in the trees to the east. I dropped my pack and ran toward the sound, crashing through underbrush and stumbling over roots. "Rob, I'm here. Where the hell have you been?" I burst into a small clearing and found him standing with his back to me, perfectly still. He was wearing the same clothes as the night before, jeans and a fleece jacket, but they looked wrong somehow. Too clean, too new. "Rob, thank God. Are you okay? What happened?" He turned around slowly, and my words died in my throat. It was Rob's face, but it was wrong. The features were all correct. Same brown eyes, same crooked nose he'd broken playing hockey in high school, same scar on his chin from a childhood bike accident. But the expression was all wrong. He was smiling, but it wasn't Rob's smile. It was too wide, too fixed, like someone had carved it into his face with a knife. "Hello, Mike," he said, and even his voice was wrong. Still Rob's voice, but flat and emotionless. "I got lost in the dark, but I'm better now." "Jesus, Rob, you scared the shit out of me. I thought you were dead. What happened to you out there?" He tilted his head to one side, still wearing that horrible smile. "I met someone who wanted to talk." "Who? There's nobody else out here for miles." "Oh, there's always someone out here, Mike. Always watching. Always hungry." His smile widened even further, and I noticed his teeth looked too sharp. He told me such interesting things. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. This wasn't Rob. Something was wearing my friend's face, speaking with his voice, but it wasn't him. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. "Rob, you're scaring me, man. Are you feeling okay? Did you hit your head?" "I feel wonderful," he said, taking a step closer. "Better than I've ever felt." He showed me what I really am, Mike. What we all really are underneath. Just meat and bones and blood, waiting to be consumed. I backed away, my hand instinctively reaching for the knife on my belt. "Rob, listen to me. You're not making sense. You might have hypothermia or a concussion. We need to get you to a hospital." "I don't need a hospital," he said, still approaching with that measured, predatory pace. "I need you to understand. He's coming for you too, Mike. And when he does, you'll see how beautiful it is. How pure." "Who's coming for me?" "Rob, you're freaking me out here." "The Hungry One, the Winter King. He has so many names." Rob's eyes were completely black now, I realized with growing horror. No iris, no pupil, just solid black like pools of oil. "He told me about you, Mike, about how you taste fear, how you taste pain. He's very excited to meet you." That's when I ran. I turned and sprinted back toward the campsite, crashing through the forest like a madman. Behind me, I could hear Rob, or the thing wearing Rob's face, following at a leisurely pace. It wasn't running, it didn't need to, it knew exactly where I was going. I reached the campsite and grabbed my pack, not bothering to organize anything. I just stuffed my sleeping bag and gear inside as fast as I could, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the zippers. I had to get out of here. I had to get help. "Mike," Rob's voice called from the trees. "Where are you going? We're having such a nice conversation." I shouldered my pack and started running down the trail toward the car. The path was rough and treacherous, full of roots and loose rocks, but I didn't care. I had 8 miles of wilderness between me and civilization, and something wearing my best friend's face was hunting me. The sun was high and bright now, but it did nothing to warm the air or dispel the sense of wrongness that hung over these mountains like a shroud. The forest felt different than it had the day before. More hostile, more alive. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Shadows moved in my peripheral vision, always just out of sight when I turned to look. I'd been running for maybe 20 minutes when I heard Rob's voice again, this time ahead of me on the trail. "Mike, wait up!" I stopped dead in my tracks. That was impossible. I'd left him behind at the campsite. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me, not without passing me on the narrow trail. I looked around frantically, trying to spot another route he might have taken, but the forest here was too thick. Nothing but dense undergrowth and massive tree trunks stretching in every direction. "Mike, where are you going?" The voice was definitely coming from up ahead, around a bend in the trail. I thought we were friends. I turned around and started running back the way I'd come. If Rob, or whatever was wearing his face, was ahead of me, I'd have to find another way out. Maybe I could circle around through the forest, pick up the trail further down. But after only a few steps, I heard his voice behind me again. "Mike, this is silly. You can't run from me forever." I was trapped. Somehow, impossibly, Rob was both ahead of me and behind me on a single narrow trail. My rational mind insisted this couldn't be happening, but the evidence of my senses was undeniable. I plunged into the forest, abandoning the trail completely. If I could navigate by the sun, maybe I could find my way back to the road. The undergrowth was thick and hostile, grabbing at my clothes and pack, but I forced my way through. Branches whipped across my face, leaving stinging cuts on my cheeks and forehead. For the next several hours, I stumbled through the wilderness in a growing panic. The sun was obscured by thick clouds, making navigation impossible. Every tree looked the same, every ridge identical to the last. I was completely lost, but I kept moving, driven by the knowledge that something inhuman was hunting me through these mountains. As the afternoon wore on, I began to hear sounds in the forest around me, footsteps that stopped whenever I stopped, branches breaking in my wake, and always, just at the edge of hearing, Rob's voice calling my name. "Mike. Mike. Where are you, Mike?" Sometimes it sounded like he was right behind me. Other times it seemed to come from miles away, echoing off the mountain peaks. But it never stopped. Never gave me a moment's peace. By evening, I was exhausted and hypothermic. My water was nearly gone, and I hadn't eaten anything since that energy bar at dawn. My hands were so cold I could barely feel them, and my legs felt like jelly. I needed to find shelter, build a fire, get warm. But every time I stopped to rest, I heard those footsteps getting closer. I found myself in a small valley as the sun was setting, surrounded by towering evergreens that blocked out most of the fading light. There was a stream here, the water black and cold, flowing over moss-covered rocks. I knelt by the bank and drank deeply, the ice-cold water shocking my system but clearing my head slightly. That's when I saw him. Rob was standing on the other side of the stream, maybe 30 feet away, watching me with those horrible black eyes. He wasn't smiling anymore. His face was completely expressionless, like a mannequin. "Hello, Mike," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "You look tired." I scrambled to my feet, backing away from the stream. "Stay away from me. I know you're not Rob." "Of course I'm Rob," he said, tilting his head. "I'm your best friend, remember? We've known each other since college. Rob doesn't have black eyes. Rob doesn't talk like that." "People change, Mike. I've simply become more honest about what I am." He stepped into the stream, and I noticed he didn't seem to feel the cold water at all. It should have been freezing. I could see ice forming along the banks, but he walked through it like it was a warm bath. "What did you do to him?" I screamed. "Where's my friend?" "I am your friend," Rob said, still approaching with that same measured pace, "and I want to share something wonderful with you. He showed me the truth, Mike, about what we really are, about what we're meant to become." I turned and ran again, crashing through the darkening forest. Behind me, I could hear splashing as Rob crossed the stream, but he still wasn't running. He didn't need to. He knew I had nowhere to go. The forest was pitch black now, and I was running blind, guided only by the faint glow of stars through the canopy. I tripped over roots and slammed into tree trunks, adding fresh cuts and bruises to my collection. My pack caught on a low branch and nearly spun me around, but I kept moving. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to stretch and distort in the darkness. It could have been minutes or hours. Eventually, I stumbled into another clearing, this one larger than the last, with a rocky outcropping on one side that would give me some protection. I collapsed against the rocks, gasping for breath, my lungs burning in the cold air. I needed to think. I needed a plan. But my mind felt sluggish and confused, probably from hypothermia and exhaustion. I fumbled for my flashlight and swept it across the clearing. Empty. No sign of Rob or whatever was wearing his face. Maybe I'd finally lost him in the darkness. I allowed myself a moment of hope. Maybe I could rest here for a few hours, get my strength back. Maybe when the sun came up, I could find my way back to the trail. That's when I heard the singing. It was coming from somewhere in the trees. A low, wordless melody that seemed to echo off the mountains. The voice was beautiful, hauntingly so, but there was something wrong with it. Something that made my skin crawl and my teeth ache. The singing grew louder, and I realized it was getting closer. Moving through the forest toward my hiding place, and underneath the melody, I could hear something else, the sound of branches breaking, of something large moving through the undergrowth. I clicked off my flashlight and pressed myself against the rocks, trying to become invisible. The singing continued, growing ever closer, and now I could make out words in the melody. They weren't in English, weren't in any language I recognized, but somehow I understood their meaning. "Come out, little one. Come out and play. The hungry one is waiting." My heart was hammering so loud I was sure whatever was out there would hear it. The singing stopped abruptly, leaving only that oppressive silence. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Rob's voice called out from the darkness. "Mike, I know you're here. I can smell your fear." I held my breath, not daring to move. Through the trees, I could see a faint glow approaching. Not the steady beam of a flashlight, but something organic, pulsing like a heartbeat. "He's coming, Mike," Rob's voice continued, though I still couldn't see him. "He's almost here, and when he arrives, we're going to have such fun together." The glow was getting brighter, and now I could hear footsteps. Not just Rob's, but something else. Something heavier, with a strange rhythm that didn't sound quite human. "You can't hide forever," Rob said, and his voice was directly in front of me now, just beyond the rocks. "He can taste your terror. It's like wine to him." I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped up and ran, abandoning all pretense of stealth. Behind me, Rob laughed, a sound like breaking glass that echoed off the mountains. "Run, little rabbit," he called. "Make it interesting." I plunged back into the forest, no longer caring about direction or navigation. I just ran, driven by pure animal panic. The glow followed me, always just out of sight but never falling behind. And with it came that terrible singing, weaving through the trees like a living thing. I burst out of the tree line onto what looked like an old logging road. Just two parallel ruts grown over with grass, but it was clearer than the forest. I turned downhill, hoping it would lead me back to civilization. The road was rough and overgrown, but I could make better time here than fighting through the undergrowth. I ran until my lungs felt like they were going to burst, until my legs could barely carry me. Behind me, the glow grew steadily brighter. I topped a small rise and saw lights ahead. Real lights, electric and warm and wonderfully normal. A house sitting by itself in a small clearing. Smoke was rising from the chimney, and I could see a pickup truck parked in the driveway. I nearly cried with relief. People, help, safety. I stumbled down the hill toward the house, my legs barely supporting me. As I got closer, I could see it was an old farmhouse, probably built in the 1800s. The windows glowed with yellow light, and I could smell wood smoke and something cooking. Bacon, maybe, or sausage. I pounded on the front door with both fists. "Help!" I screamed. "Please, somebody help me." The door opened, revealing an elderly man in flannel pajamas. He had kind eyes and a gray beard, and he looked exactly like what you'd expect from a New Hampshire farmer. "Good Lord, son," he said, taking in my battered appearance. "What happened to you?" "My friend," I gasped, barely able to speak. "Something took him. Something in the woods. It's following me." The man looked past me into the darkness, his expression growing serious. "Come inside," he said, stepping back to let me enter. "Get warm. We'll call the authorities." I stumbled into his living room, grateful for the warmth and the normal human smells of coffee and wood smoke. The man, he introduced himself as Earl Hutchins, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and handed me a mug of hot coffee. "Now," he said, settling into a worn armchair across from me, "tell me what happened." I told him everything: Rob's disappearance, his return changed, the pursuit through the forest. Earl listened without interruption, his expression growing more troubled with each detail. "You were up near Mount Isolation?" he asked when I finished. I nodded. "That's where we were camping." Earl was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Finally, he spoke. "My grandfather used to tell stories about that mountain," he said slowly. "Old stories from before the white men came. The Abenaki called it Wendigo Mountain. Said something lived up there that fed on human flesh and souls. Wendigo. I'd heard the word before, in other Native American legends. A cannibal spirit," Earl explained. "According to the stories, it could possess people, turn them into monsters, make them crave human flesh." He looked at me seriously. "Most folks around here think it's just old superstition, but there have been disappearances over the years. Hikers who went into those mountains and never came out." As if summoned by his words, there was a knock at the door. We both froze. Earl looked at the clock on the mantel. It was past midnight. Nobody made social calls at this hour, especially not way out here. The knock came again, polite but insistent. "But, Earl?" Rob's voice called from outside. "I know Mike is in there. We just want to talk." Earl's face went white. "That your friend?" I nodded, unable to speak. The thing wearing Rob's face had found me. "Earl, please," Rob continued, his voice muffled by the door. "We're very cold out here. Won't you let us warm ourselves by your fire?" "Us." He'd said us. Earl moved to the window and peered through the curtains. He jerked back immediately, his face even paler than before. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "How many of them are there?" I joined him at the window and looked outside. My blood turned to ice. There were at least a dozen figures standing in Earl's front yard, all perfectly still, all staring at the house. I recognized Rob immediately. He was standing closest to the door, still wearing that horrible fixed smile. But the others. They looked human at first glance, but wrong in subtle ways. Too tall or too thin, limbs that bent at unnatural angles, faces that were almost right but not quite, like someone had tried to reconstruct human features from memory. And their eyes. All of them had those same solid black eyes. "Earl," Rob called again. "Don't make this difficult. We know Mike is in there. We can smell him." Earl grabbed an old hunting rifle from above the fireplace and checked to make sure it was loaded. "The back door," he whispered to me. "We'll go out the back and try to reach my truck." But even as he said it, we heard movement at the rear of the house, footsteps on the back porch. We were surrounded. "Earl, this is your last chance," Rob said, and now his voice carried a threat. "Open the door, or we'll come in anyway." Earl raised the rifle and pointed it at the front door. "My grandfather left me more than stories," he said grimly. "He left me ways to fight them." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of what looked like rock salt mixed with herbs. He scattered it across the doorway and windowsills, muttering something under his breath in a language I didn't recognize. "That might slow them down," he said, But it won't stop them for long. We need to... The front door exploded inward. Rob stood in the doorway, no longer bothering to maintain his human facade. His limbs were elongated now, stretching his clothes grotesquely. His fingers had become claws, black and sharp as razors. His mouth had opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. But worst of all were his eyes. Still black, but now I could see things moving in them. Writhing shapes that hurt to look at directly. "Hello, Mike," he said, his voice now a wet, grinding sound. "Did you miss me?" Earl fired the rifle point-blank into Rob's chest. The impact sent him staggering backward, but he didn't fall. Dark fluid leaked from the wound, but he just smiled that horrible smile and kept coming. "Iron," Earl said desperately, working the bolt action. Iron and salt and prayer. That's what Grandfather said. But before he could fire again, the windows exploded inward. The other creatures poured through, moving with inhuman speed and grace. Earl managed to get off one more shot before they reached him. I'll never forget the sound he made when they took him. It wasn't quite a scream. It was too primal for that. Too raw. It was the sound of a soul being torn apart. I ran for the back door, but more creatures were waiting there. I was trapped in the middle of the living room, surrounded by things that had once been human but were now something else entirely. Rob approached slowly, savoring the moment. "Did you really think you could escape?" he asked, his voice now coming from multiple throats at once. "Did you think we would let you go?" "What do you want?" I whispered. "To share the gift," Rob said. "To show you what lies beneath the flesh. To make you part of our family." One of the creatures dragged Earl's body over and dropped it at Rob's feet. The old man was still breathing, but barely. Blood leaked from dozens of wounds and his eyes were unfocused with shock. "Watch," Rob said, kneeling beside Earl. "Watch and learn." He placed his hand on Earl's forehead, and the old man's body convulsed. His back arched impossibly high and that terrible scream came again. But this time, it gradually changed. The pain and terror faded away, replaced by something else, something hungry and cruel. When it was over, Earl stood up. His wounds were gone, healed completely, but his eyes were black now, just like the others. "Thank you," Earl said to Rob, his voice flat and emotionless. "I understand now." Rob turned back to me, still smiling. "Your turn, Mike." That's when I remembered the knife on my belt. It was just a small camping knife, nothing special, but the blade was steel. Iron, like Earl had said. As Rob reached for me, I pulled the knife and drove it into his throat. Rob staggered backward, black fluid pouring from the wound, but instead of falling, he laughed. "Iron," he said, pulling the knife out and tossing it aside. "Clever, but you need more than iron to hurt us, Mike. You need faith. You need purity. You need things you've never had." The other creatures began to close in, moving in perfect synchronization like a pack of wolves. I had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. After hours of terror and pursuit, it was finally over. But then I heard something that made my heart skip a beat. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. Rob heard it too. His head snapped up, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he looked concerned. "They're coming," one of the other creatures said, its voice like grinding gravel. "Too many," another added. "Too much light." Rob looked at me with those horrible black eyes, and I saw something like regret there. Another time, "Mike," he said, "when there are fewer witnesses, when the light is dimmer." And then, impossibly, they were gone. All of them, including Earl. One moment the room was full of monsters, the next it was empty except for me and the wreckage of Earl's home. The helicopters were getting closer. I could see searchlights sweeping across the forest through the broken windows. I stumbled outside just as the first aircraft landed in Earl's front yard. "Michael Williams?" one of the searchers called out. "Are you Michael Williams?" I nodded, too exhausted and traumatized to speak. "We've been looking for you for 2 days. the man continued. "Your car was found at the Dry River campground. What happened to your friend Robert Johnson?" 2 days. I'd been running through those mountains for 2 days, though it felt like weeks. "He's gone," I said finally. "Something took him." They found Rob's body 3 days later at the bottom of a ravine about 2 miles from our campsite. The official cause of death was hypothermia and injuries consistent with a fall. The authorities concluded that he'd gotten up in the night to relieve himself, become disoriented in the dark, and fallen to his death. They never found Earl Hutchins. When I led them to his house, it was just an empty foundation overgrown with weeds. The locals insisted no one had lived there for over 50 years, not since old Earl died in a hunting accident back in the 1970s. I tried to tell them what really happened, but who would believe such a story? Even I have trouble believing it sometimes in the bright light of day. But I know what I saw. I know what hunted me through those mountains. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear Rob's voice calling my name, and sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I think I see something moving behind my own eyes, something dark and hungry, waiting for its chance to emerge. I haven't been camping since. I probably never will again, because I know they're still out there, in the deep places where civilization hasn't reached. Still waiting. Still hungry. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if maybe Rob was right. Maybe it would have been better to join them willingly, to accept the gift they offered. Because now I'm caught between 2 worlds, no longer fully human, but not yet one of them. I'm 30 years old now, and this happened 2 years ago. But every October, when the leaves start to turn and the air grows cold, I feel them calling to me, pulling me back toward Mount Isolation, toward the family I left behind. I don't know how much longer I can resist.